Hello everybody, welcome back to More Sins of the Father. We're going to be reading chapter 22 today, and it's a good chapter. It's nice and lengthy and quite a lot is about to happen, so dig in because it's going to get good. At least I think so. And I'm totally unbiased. I'm just going to jump straight in today. Chapter 22. Esther Adamson's bungalow was on the outskirts of Blackthorn, the town that was the next residential area over from Marytown, and in many ways its relative, founded by the grandfather of the man who founded the place in which all of the horrific drama had unfolded. Martha hadn't been particularly looking forward to seeing her aunt again after their earlier debate, firmly believing that they'd said all they needed to each other. But it was either that or be dropped off at her family's house where Olivia and Walsh were working, and she wasn't all ready to spend any significant time alone with either of them. So she swallowed her pride and went with Parker to Blackthorn, made good use of her living, breathing buffer. The meeting went as smooth as it could have done. Up until that point, Esther had not known that her young, grieving niece had hired the assistance of private investigators to look deeper into Martha's death, and was shocked to be filled in on everything that they'd uncovered so far. Martha might have felt some guilt for yanking the rose-tinted glasses away from her eyes, but she suspected that Esther had buried a lot of nasty truths about the man she loved, so that she could keep telling herself that he was a gentleman. It was funny how many people claim to have known the worst after a person's darkness becomes available for public consumption. If only they'd spoken up sooner. How much heartache could it have spared? How much pain? Martha hated those kinds of people more than she hated the willfully ignorant, like her Aunt Esther. Thankfully, the woman did happen to have what they were looking for, claiming that she'd seen it in William's possession before he died, and that he'd promised it to her. Martha didn't believe that for a moment, but she refrained from outright accusing her aunt of lying to cover up her petty theft. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter. She was just relieved that it'd been located, so that they could finally put the horrific mess that was William Ford's dark legacy to rest, and Amanda could begin to move forward. Wary that it had been allegedly used to siphon magical energy from the woman that had been brutally murdered, Martha refused to touch the amulet until Parker had placed it inside of a clear plastic evidence bag. She knew very little about the occult, but as far as she was concerned, it was as dangerous as a live hand grenade, and the only person that she trusted had the necessary protection against it was someone who couldn't easily be hurt, a magical null like Parker. As they were driving back towards Marytown, Martha couldn't help but think about how ineffectual and unintimidating the thing looked up close and in person, so to speak. The chain that held it was strong and gold, the large pendant circular with an engraving that looked like a simplified version of what she'd seen drawn out on the study floor. Olivia seemed to think that the basic magic of the circle had been manipulated by something more powerful than its creator. The talisman led a lot of credence to that theory, and made Martha finally feel positive about the progress they'd made. There was light at the end of the tunnel. She could see it. It was a shame that the feeling wasn't destined to last, for as they drove around a corner towards where Martha had met up with Stephen the night before, something stepped out into the road, moving so fast that Parker was forced to slam down hard on the brakes. The car skid and then spun out of control. The last thing Martha remembered before she blacked out was a rushing blur of road, dirt and tree branches attacking the windscreen, and an explosion of pain behind her eyes as her head was snapped sideways, striking the window next to her. Oh, and the laughter. The loud, certain sound of something being mightily amused that she was in a car plummeting down a hillside, an ambush perfectly played out. When she eventually opened her eyes, Martha found that she was being dragged from the wreckage by an entity that had a pair of strong hands and stronger arms. She fought against them because instinct kicked in, and she didn't know what else to do. There was no way she was going to let them abduct her again. No damn way. She bucked against her aggressor's grip, lashed out with elbows and her arms as they came free of the vehicle. It wasn't until the sound of her name, grunted in a familiar voice, broke through her panic, and she stopped struggling, allowed herself to be lifted from the crashed car, ultimately finding herself enveloped in arms that freed her. "You're okay. You're okay," the voice was saying over and over, thick with a heady mix of relief and fear. "I've got you. You're okay." She stumbled over saying his name, shaky with shock and fear. "It's okay," he said again. "Can you stand on your own?" "Yeah, I think so," she said breathlessly. Her feet found the ground and she was somewhat relieved to discover that her body still worked in the way that it was meant to, limbs all intact and functional. She looked up into a pair of eyes that she knew oh so well. They were dilated, filled with fear, adrenaline still pounding through his body as a result of the accident. His breath came out in ragged gasps. His hand moved from her waist to her shoulders, then to her neck and her face as if he was feeling for himself, checking that she was genuinely all right, and she just stood there and let him, not knowing how to react to it, still unsure of what on earth had happened and how they'd ended up off the road. Parker pressed his forehead to hers, and for a scary moment she thought that he was maybe about to kiss her. But then rustling came from the trees and gave them the answer to her muddled questions, and she both found herself relieved and terrified. Every inch of her body went on high alert, readying itself for the ambush. She pushed herself away from Parker, who simply glanced around in confusion, not understanding what was happening, what was coming for them. Martha's hand instinctively went to her lower back, but found nothing there. But of course, she had not dressed for a fight, and had left her dagger at the house they'd been heading back to. That was foolish. She should have been prepared for the possibility of retribution for what she'd done the night before. She should have planned for it. Never have let her pride once again blind her into thinking that her plan couldn't possibly be flawed. Damn it. Damn it all the way to Marytown and back. Martha, her companion, spoke, reaching out to clasp her wrist, which she'd wrenched free, glaring at him and hushing him, while she tried to focus on what was out in the woods without dropping her defences and risking herself before she was ready to do so. There were many of them, and they were closing in fast. She could sense them as clearly as she could her heartbeat, pounding away erratically in her chest. If they were alone, she could probably make a break for it. If she were alone, she could probably make a break for it. Head into the hills and hope for the best, trust in her survival skills, her instincts. But she wasn't alone. And as certain as she was that Parker could keep up with her, she couldn't risk them getting separated, and him being targeted as a way to make her surrender to her foes, and that didn't leave her many options. Okay, we don't have much time, she spoke very quickly, asking him, I don't suppose you have any sort of weapon close to hand? Even though it was very clear he had no idea what was going on, he cagily answered, There's a shotgun in the back of the car. Martha was impressed. Glancing over her shoulder, she ordered, Get it. Meeting her gaze with a lot of suspicion, he spoke her name, but she didn't have time to explain or placate him, and said, Please, just trust me, Parker. Get the gun out of the car and don't do anything else. And do you have anything else? Like a knife. I prefer to use blades if I can. Yeah, he conceded warily, heading to the back of the crash car. As he did what she asked, without further argument, Martha watched the tree line for movement, but so far nothing seemed inclined to break through and engage them. Strange, but okay. When Parker reappeared at her side, he had a shotgun in one hand and what appeared to be a sheathed military-issue combat knife in the other. She instinctively took the sheath, opened it out to find a sharp, deadly-looking blade that she knew would more than do the trick. Very impressive, and it would work perfectly. So this is what's going to happen, she said, trying to remain as composed as possible as she fell into a combat-ready stance. Do not move, and keep that shotgun aimed at the trees. If anything comes through, and I mean anything at all, especially if it looks big, male, and like it wants to rip your face off, shoot it first, and don't ask. Martha, what the hell is going on? He angrily pressed, unable to help himself. What's out there? What are you gearing up for? How to answer that, Martha didn't know, at least not in a way that wouldn't invite more questions, and she didn't have the luxury of time to answer. There was a high likelihood that he was going to get to see for himself soon enough, so it felt like a bit of a cop-out to simply reply, Very bad people, as she turned her back on him. After a tense moment, he unhappily conceded, Fine. She felt him move into position at her side, staying close enough to shadow her, and yet give her space, even more impressive. But then Martha recalled what Amanda had said about him going off and enlisting at one point. His experience in the army was coming to the fore, and she felt somewhat relieved to at least have somebody at her back who knew how to defend themselves in the thick of it. Somebody that was trained to fight, because he was going to need to. A vanguard broke through the tree line off to her left. Parker did not hesitate, pausing for only long enough to check his target before hitting it directly in the chest, causing it to stumble back in shock, but then it kept on coming. Martha was prepared to move in and assist, but another assailant came from the right, so she instead rushed to meet it, expertly ducking the first intended blow and plunging the blade that she carried up into the soft flesh below the fiend's ribcage. Quickly and efficiently she dragged the combat knife across the demon's stomach, seriously wounding her target and then shoving it away so that it fell to the ground, clutching at its guts in an attempt to vainly keep its vital organs on the inside to try and survive. This time Martha didn't stop to watch it die. She moved on. She had to. They were coming. The second line of vanguards broke through the trees. Even though she wasn't alone, they went for her rather than attacking her companion. because even though he meant an awful lot to her, Michael Parker was insignificant to her enemies. She was the one they wanted because she was their enemy, and he was merely human. They'd keep him alive, if not necessarily safe. Martha wished she could protect him better, but there was no time for sentimentality. She was being assaulted. She needed to fight. If there was ever a time when she appreciated the hard years of training she'd endured after her abduction, now was it. Instinct kicked in and she succeeded where she'd failed the night before, not allowing her enemies to ambush her from behind, dealing with each one that rushed her with precise and deadly accuracy. Her mentor had not taught her to simply fight for sport, but for survival, and a fallen enemy could not get back up to make her falter, hit hard, hit fast, live to see them fail. Martha didn't know exactly how many she took out before they seemed to realise that their numbers game wasn't going to be as effective as they'd hoped, but she was once again covered in blood, and had only taken a few blows that would hurt later. The remaining vanguards seemed to decide that the battle was not worth it and withdrew almost as quickly as they came, fleeing into the trees. Panting heavily, Martha held her ground, watched them go, but she did not celebrate, because she knew that as well trained as she was and as hard as she had fought, she shouldn't have been enough to frighten them off. Something else had happened, something that changed the game in her favour, something unreal. The shrieks and growls and cries of agony that came from deep within the trees gave her an inkling as to what, but she couldn't trust sounds alone. Breaking into a run, she plunged into the tree line and was unsurprised rather than horrified by the sights that greeted her. Bodies had been torn apart. Dead vanguards hung from tree branches, limp and decimated. It was a battleground, and the fight was already over, so fast, so efficient, and with absolutely no sign of the victor. A loud crack of the shotgun drew her attention sharply back to the clearing that she had left. Her heart all but slammed into her chest, and she turned away from the gruesome scene, racing back through the thick barrage of trees. Her throat burned, fresh air colliding with spent breath. She became acutely aware of the muscles in her legs, strained by all of the exertion, of the sweat and blood that soaked her body and the pumping through her veins. Branches groped at her like scrawny fingers, long and sharp nails attempting to split skin, but she wouldn't stop, leaping with an athletic grace over strangled roots, fallen logs, and the bodies of her fallen, butchered foes. The army of trees ended abruptly. Martha stopped dead in her tracks at the sight that greeted her. Parker was down upon his knees, hands locked behind his head, which was now cut open just above the brow line. There was a very tall, heavily set male levelling his shotgun back at him. 4 others, similarly built males, surrounded the 2 of them, staring down at the human with mistrust and anger. Panic flooded Martha's chest, because these were not vanguards, nor were they demonic grunts. The males that stood in the clearing were elite, and they didn't take personal attacks against them very well at all. She should know. She sparred with them almost daily. Moving forward and pushing her way through the solid wall of muscle, she loudly yelled out, "Stop! Isaac, wait!" The male with the shotgun's gaze didn't sway from his hostage, but Parker lifted his eyes and locked with hers, flashing so many emotions, mostly a fury that would have floored her if she hadn't currently been determined to save his life. He could be angry at her later. She'd explain everything to him that she'd been previously unable to, because she didn't see a reason why she should keep it from him any longer. The presence of the males who had cleared the area meant one thing. The situation had changed dramatically, and she was no longer going to be able to exist in secret here. "Wait, please," she implored the imposing male. "Don't hurt him." The response was blunt, brimming ire. "You know this human?" "I do," she confirmed. "He's with me, and whatever he did, he was simply following my orders. He's not a threat to you. Let him go." Isaac continued to glare at her mortal friend for such a long time that Martha began to think that she might have to physically step between the 2 of them, which she would happily do. It was one thing for these males to react badly when they were not fully aware of the circumstances. She would not permit them to hurt somebody she cared for simply to prove a point. And she knew with absolute surety that Isaac would not go through her to do whatever he had planned. Personal feelings aside, Stefan would never forgive him. Eventually the tension in the large male's wide frame eased, and he stood down without her needing to resort to such extreme measures, moving into a neutral stance, and even extending his hand to the man who was still down on his knees on the muddy ground. Parker looked at the appendage for a long moment, as if he didn't fully trust the offering. But he had the good sense not to refuse it, allowing the bigger, clearly much stronger male to drag him back up to his feet. The shotgun was offered back to its rightful owner. It was accepted without comment or retribution. Smart. Catastrophe averted. For now. Martha sighed with relief, going to her old friend. Parker's gaze met her approach, but he did nothing, said nothing. She could tell that he was angry and confused without needing to sense it. He'd never been good at masking the emotions on his face, and she'd always been more astute than most. There was going to be a conversation, but for now he would defer to her, even though it was also clear that he didn't particularly trust her. That smarted, but it was what it was. Instead of getting into something that was going to be far too messy and personal to entangle in front of such unusual company, Martha regarded the male who was seemingly in charge of the excursion, asking him, "What the hell is going on here, Isaac?" "We have new orders," he replied succinctly. Martha waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. That was all he believed she deserved to know, and she daren't push, not today. Tensions were already too frayed, and getting into an argument was not a good plan. Gazing around the other males that had gathered in the clearing, she of course knew their faces, but didn't see a face that should have been there, the leader of this exclusive pack. She hurriedly asked Isaac, "Where is Stefan? Did he not come with you?" "I'm here." A familiar statuesque figure emerged from the trees, and finally into view, making Martha feel relieved all over again. It was not that she had a bad relationship with the other males that she often fought alongside. This particular bunch were amongst those she got along well with. They simply saw her as human, less than their equal, and therefore rarely extended the same respects they did themselves. It irked her immensely, but she knew that it would take much longer than a single mortal decade for their culture to change enough to truly accept her. She could fight alongside them and live within their elite company. It was enough, for now. "What's happening?" she asked Stefan as he moved towards her, brimming both with satisfaction of a battle well fought and a purpose as of yet unrequited. As if proving her point regarding her status, his brothers respectfully stepped out of his way and then moved back in, guarding his back, closing up into a wall of muscle behind him. "Your actions here have been noted," Stefan stated the obvious, before continuing to explain, barely able to mask the pride in his usually stoic voice. "And not simply by our enemies. This morning Gadriel petitioned the other Watchers, and my father backed his call for swift and decisive action. A vote was taken, and it went in your favour, Martha Valentine. The decision was unanimous." Confused, she asked, "What do you mean? What decision?" "To have a standing force backing up your presence here," Stefan smiled. Actually smiled. It was unnerving, but not as mind-blowing as his next words were. "We've taken back the border. From this point forward, Marytown will be under our watch, not theirs." Have a quick drink. Martha couldn't believe what she'd just heard. It had been a decade since she was shown the full extent of the demonic army which had long surrounded Marytown's border, and then bluntly informed that nothing was ever going to be done about it because the area was not deemed worthy enough of the effort by those in power. It had rankled at the time, but she'd been too hurt to care and eventually deferred to the judgment of those who knew better, to the Watchers on the Mount. The pact, the long-standing treaty formed between the demons and the Watchers, kept the town and the people that she'd left behind safe from the vanguards and masters that they served. So she'd moved on with her life. She'd left Marytown to its fate. Now her direct actions had directly resulted in a swift and decisive move that liberated the land surrounding what had once been her home. It was hard not to feel overwhelmed by that. "You should be pleased," Stefan acknowledged her surprise. "This is an important step in accomplishing something we've strived for." "It's huge," she acknowledged her understanding of the situation, but then she frowned. "Does this mean the pact will be broken?" Rather than immediately answering her question, Stefan's eyes lifted and went straightly behind her. She turned around and abruptly remembered that they were not alone. Oh, damn it. If the man behind her had been confused before, he was more than perturbed than ever by the path that conversation had taken, making the whole situation awkward before Martha even thought to consider any of the interpersonal relationships involved. In an attempt to bridge the gaping cultural abyss, she decided to make some introductions. Standing between what was easily the two most important males she'd ever had in her life. She inelegantly said, "Michael Parker, this is Stephen North. Stephen, this is Parker." Her human companion stepped forward, wary in his approach, but he at least graciously offered out his hand. Stephen briefly gazed down at the appendage, as if it were a loaded weapon, but rather than accepting this civil platitude, sternly spoke to his protégée. "Martha, a word." "Yeah, sure," she replied, feeling deflated. Turning to Parker, she tried to apologise, saying, "Sorry, I have to." "Go ahead," he assured her. "I'll just wait right here." "I think you can probably call that in," she said, pointing at the wrecked car. "This won't take long. I'll be right back, I promise." Following Stephen away from the clearing, Martha couldn't help but ponder over how insanely complicated her life had become. One of the things that had drawn her to a second chance at life that she'd been granted all those years ago was its simplicity. She would heal, and she would grow stronger. She would avenge what was done to her by allying herself with the only beings in the world that knew her abuser's weaknesses, because they'd fought them for millennia. Under the tutelage of the most adept warriors, she'd trained and had fought until she was good enough to stand alongside them, and she'd ensured over career-spanning years that innocents like her were not as harmed as she had been. She'd earned everything that she had. It had been simple, and now it was not. Now there were two worlds, each representing the two sides of her nature, and they were colliding with mind-spinning intensity. It was enough to make her feel dizzy and want to take another lie down. When she was certain they were out of earshot, Martha glowered at Stephen. Well, there was no need to be so rude to him. "Was there not?" he retorted, turning to face her displeasure, and she rolled her eyes. You'd think, given the sheer amount of time in which she'd known him, she'd be unsurprised by Stephen's often abrupt personality. But the encounter with Parker had riled her up in ways she didn't even want to think too hard about. "He's a good man. He's not about to consort with our enemies. Forgive me if I do not place as much irrational trust in your former boyfriend as you do." A surprised guffaw of laughter burst forth from Martha's lips. She shook her head and met his eyes. "Careful there, Stephen. A girl might find herself mistaking your cold, hard pragmatism for jealousy." Holding her eyes with a brusque stare of his own, he said, "I have endeavoured for many years to build your status amongst our kind, and now we finally have an opportunity to show every one of your detractors that you are more than female, more than your human upbringing. If you see my displeasure at you thinking that your old personal life is anything more than a distraction as jealousy, then perhaps I should remind you that there are more important things at stake here than any of our personal feelings." Martha swallowed. "I know that." "The pact will likely stay in place for now," he stated, seemingly answering her earlier question and dropping what had begun to feel like a very personal conversation. Typical of Stephen. "Our presence here will undoubtedly be met with retribution, but we're confident that we can hold the border and prevent them from reclaiming it." "It's a start," Martha agreed. "But where does this leave me?" "You are as we are. There's no sense in denying that. There's a good chance that when you cross the border from this point forward, it'll be seen as a declaration of war. But the response will not be immediate, and I have no intention of telling you what you should do other than to let you know that Gadriel supports what you're doing here. You made the right choice in sending your mother to be with him. He wants you to be able to take care of your family and to assist your sister with her current predicament. He offers you his support." "He mentioned Amanda," she sounded as surprised as she felt. "She is Gale's daughter. He understands your drive to protect her and wants her to be able to move forward from her grief. We all do." Martha appreciated that. If anyone could comprehend the pull of familiar bonds, it was the warrior males that had come to offer her support from the border of Marytown. It was not merely a brand of camaraderie that bonded them all together. They were brothers in every sense of the word. Internally, however, she felt very conflicted, knowing that she now had a free pass to go back into town and be with her sister, but also knowing that there would be a price to pay. Eventually, she'd have to face the male who had made this possible and thank him for what he'd done for her and Amanda, and she would rather fight 50 waves of vanguards than do that. But it was inevitable. With a newfound determination, she asked Stephen, "Can I go back?" "You are free to do what you will, Martha, as you always have been." She nodded and turned away, then paused after taking 2 steps back towards the clearing, because she hated the way that the majority of the conversation had played out, because it was Stephen, And as far as she could tell, it was not only Gadriel who had made a lot of really amazing things happen for her since they parted ways a few hours before. "Thank you, Stefan," she said softly, "for what you did for my mother and all of this. I feel much better knowing that you're here. Don't hesitate to come and find me should you need to." "I won't," she promised. "In the usual place?" "I shall be there," he said, and she didn't doubt for a moment that he would. By the time that she'd returned to the clearing, the other males had gone, leaving the bittersweet distraction that was her old personal life standing alone by the wrecked Empire Honda. You watched her approach with a little bit of fear and a lot of suspicion. There was a distinct edge in his tone as he informed her. "There's a recovery vehicle on the way. Should be here within the next half an hour." "Okay, great." "Yeah," he retorted angrily. "That should give you plenty of time to kill the witness and disappear the body." "Excuse me?" she responded incredulously before realising what he was implying. Shocked, she stepped forward and tried to assure him, "No, Parker, no, it isn't like that. I would never do that." I'm finding that very difficult to believe right now. Taking a deep breath, she resisted the urge to look at her feet to break the intensity of his stare. His anger and his mistrust were utterly understandable, and she had no right to tell him that what he should be feeling given everything that he'd just witnessed. He was afraid of her and what he'd seen, and that made her feel incredibly guilty, but it would be selfish to not let him mentally process the situation in his own way. "I won't try to tell you that you can trust me," she said, carefully picking her words, "but you should know that I could never, ever do anything to intentionally hurt you. For God's sakes, I'm not evil. That look that you're giving me right now, I never wanted you to look at me like that. And I don't enjoy doing what I had to just do. But when it comes down to it, I will fight. I will defend myself. I will never let them take me again against my will. Never again." After a considered stretch of silence in which he continued to stare at her, searching for something that she sure as hell hoped he would find, he dropped his shoulders and almost despondently said something that almost broke her. "They looked human." "I know," she said. "But they weren't. They were demons." "Yeah, your charming friend filled me in about that right before he made himself and all the bodies disappear into thin air. But hey, at least he shook my hand before he left. I guess I can't complain too much." "Please don't take any of that personally," she tried to explain to him, feeling quite riled that she was now having to stand there and make excuses for her mentor's rudeness. "Stefan is just Stefan." Parker folded his arms across his chest, a defensive act, and it was not lost on Martha that she'd just described Stefan to him in almost the same way that he had described Olivia when he had told her that she didn't have to be intimidated. It was not intentional, but she suspected that whatever she said next, the damage had already been done. "I know you asked me about my personal life," she tried to explain anyway, "and I probably should have mentioned him to you right then, but it's not what you think. I just didn't know what to say. And as for Stefan, he's just very blunt and protective of me." "Protective or possessive?" "It isn't like that," Martha very quickly asserted, though she didn't know why she felt like she had to. Her relationship with Stefan might have appeared complex, but it was simple. At least it felt that way to her. She didn't expect her old friend to understand. As if he'd been able to read her mind, which of course was impossible, Parker proved how adept an investigator he'd become by saying, "He saved you. He found you when you were abducted, and he saved you. He then helped you recover after he saved you. He also trained you, gave you a second chance at life when you felt like you had absolutely nothing left to live for. He gave you a purpose. You chose to be with him rather than come back home and be with us. Is that close to what it's like, or did I get that wrong as well?" No, he hadn't. Deciding to honour his frankness, Martha added, "We live together, in the same residence, separate rooms. He's very important to me, and we have a bond. But it's utterly platonic. We're not together." "Right," he said, turning his back on her and going back to the car, tone suggesting that he didn't believe her in the slightest, but was more than done with the conversation. "Are you hurt?" "No," she assured. "Nothing that won't heal." "How's your head?" Ignoring her concern, he stated, "You have blood all over you." Martha looked down at herself and noted that he was right. The clothes that she'd pulled from her old closet in the early hours were ruined, soaked in the blood and viscera of the vanguards that she'd been forced to fight and kill. In other circumstances, she'd have thrown them out and not thought about it. But for some reason it brought a lump to her throat and a tear to her eye to see the vestiges of her old life so viscerally ruined by the brutality of the new. It was illogical. They were only clothes, after all. Pulling a large black holdall out of the back of the car, Parker informed her, "There should be a change of clothes in there that'll fit you," before dropping it at her feet. Seeing the confusion on her face, he less than subtly added, "They belong to Olivia. We carry a spare set of clothing and supplies around in every Empire vehicle, because investigations can sometimes get messy." "Is that why you carry a shotgun around too?" "The knife as well," he replied thinly. "Only that one's mine, and I'd like it back if it's okay with you. It means a lot to me." "Oh," she looked around, realising that she'd dropped the combat knife a little way off into the clearing, though she didn't remember doing so, probably when she'd seen him in danger. Still, that was no excuse. She was always so very careful with her own dagger. Noting its location, she busied stripping herself of the bloody ruined clothes from her body. Her underwear and t-shirt were the only items that hadn't been spattered, and because it felt the right thing to do, she retrieved and wrapped the bloody blade up in it, informing Parker that she'd clean it before returning it to him. It seemed like the very least that she could do. The remainder of her clothing, including the checkered shirt that she'd been so fond of, went into a black bin liner. It felt like a great shame, but she let it go. Parker turned and handed her a bottle of water, which she'd also retrieved from a stash of supplies in the back of the car. If she'd learned anything from this encounter, it was that the staff of Empire were prepared for absolutely anything, even a vehicular demon ambush. She used the bottled water to clean the blood off her hands and skin before rooting through the holdall for the clothes of a woman who had to be about 10 foot taller and so much curvier than her. What she found was a soft, almost lacy cobalt grey vest and a pair of jeans that fit better than expected. The jacket was fitted, black, and looked like it was designed to go with a smart business suit. Martha put it on simply because it was cold and she was feeling far too shaky, coming down from the adrenaline rush of fighting for her life and everything that had followed. In reality, the outfit was too dressy for her tastes. But when she finished getting dressed, Parker was standing with his back to her, as if to give her privacy. She was grateful for that. It hadn't been necessary. Nothing had been exposed that he hadn't seen before, but it was nice that he was being a gentleman. Martha let him know that she was done and moved towards him, noting that he was looking at the gold chain talisman that they'd gone to retrieve only a little while ago. It was still in its bag, and she realised that it must have tumbled off her lap when the car spun out of control. At least they hadn't lost it. That was something. She asked him, "Are we still going to take that to the house?" "I'm going to call Olivia once we're out of here and tell her to leave it for tonight," he said. "By the time that we're done, it'll be too late. The recovery people will drop us off at Empire, where I can leave a message for Maxwell and let him know what happened. And then we're going straight home. We can carry on with all of this tomorrow." "I don't know if that's the most productive plan, but we were in a car crash, Martha," he argued. "You knocked your head and you passed out. Nobody's going to judge you for taking a night off to recover from that. I would wager it'll be expected." "I don't have the luxury of sitting back and taking it easy," she said. "Amanda needs the answers that thing can give us. I'm not going to leave her hanging because I got a little bump on the head. I don't need rest. I'll be fine. I'd much rather get on with things. Amanda isn't going to care what we find out about her father if you get hurt in the process," Parker countered. "Do you not think that she'll be more concerned that you were run off the road? That you could have been killed today?" He sounded very irate, annoyed by her stubbornness, and he didn't seem to be shy in letting her know how self-centered he thought she was being. "I get that you're some kind of quick-healing super-killer now, but you're not invulnerable to everything that goes on around you." "I never claimed that I was," she frowned, hating the tension. "Then just stop." "Parker, what?" he replied angrily, before pausing and sighing. "I'm not going to stand here and fight with you. It doesn't help anything. We've had an accident, and we need to get this mess fixed, and we're going home. You might be fine to carry on, but I'm not." With this last statement, Martha suddenly realised that it wasn't about her at all, and that she was indeed being selfish. Parker had gone through all of this alongside her, but he hadn't rested, and he had just had the world pulled out from under him once again. She knew that she'd become determined to take care of her sister and fix everything that had decimated her world, but she now remindedly dragged others along on her leash. While she could easily go for days focusing on her objective, she needed to remind herself that these people were not like her. They got tired. They got emotional. They got hurt. They needed time to recover. "Is your head going to be okay?" she asked him, feeling so guilty. "It's fine," he said, turning away from her. "Superficial. Doesn't hurt." And he had always branded her the stubborn one. Okay, so that was quite a long chapter. A lot happened. I like action stuff. Get a nice flow to it. Just not my microphone, sorry. So they went and retrieved the talisman amulet. Apparently I interchange it through there from Aunt Esther, filling her in on everything that had been going on. And as they were driving back, they were ambushed. And yes, Parker got a rather abrupt introduction to the other side of Martha's life, which she has been keeping under wraps and to herself. And now she's not going to be able to do that because he's just seen it all and seen her in action. And fortunately, or unfortunately, we will see, her cohorts have stepped in to help save the day. And now there is a standing force of her otherworldly cohorts around Marytown to have her back, as well as some personal tension going on there. So yeah, when we come back, we will be dealing with the fallout of all of that. And by my reckoning, there's about 4 days worth left to do. And then I'm probably going to take a really short break. I'm not sure, or go straight into the next book. Depends on how ready it is, because I need to go through, as I work through the next book, I'm basically going to be working through each chapter, going through the edits and making sure that it's okay, and then I'm going to be reading it out as I do it. So yeah, it's kind of going to be a work in progress. So I need to work and get myself into gear as we're going through it, and it'll be a good way of checking through and reading it out loud. So, but that is for next week. Fingers crossed. My microphone might be coming today, so fingers crossed. Everything's fine by then. I hope everybody has a great weekend. I might record some more later on if my microphone turns up today. But yeah, I hope everyone has a brilliant weekend. I shall see you over the course of the weekend. It's here! Ah! Oh my goodness me! I was about to shout at you for interrupting me.
Yeah, I know.
It arrived! Ah! So yeah, I think I probably will be recording some more later on today to check this out. Yeah, and I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. Oh my god!